Fucking pig, Clint Eastwood spoke angrily at Jimmy Kimmel, pointing in his face. What happens when a Hollywood legend faces a smug host who thinks he can tear him down with a smirk and a cheap shot? Clint Eastwood, the man whose steely glare could silence a room, walked onto Jimmy Kimmel's set that night with a purpose. He was there to promote his latest film, a gritty western that poured his heart into the craft he'd mastered over decades. But Jimmy, with his slick suit and sharper tongue, had other plans. The studio buzzed with anticipation, the audience primed for another round of Kimmel's biting humor. Nobody expected the storm that was coming. Clint settled into the guest chair, his weathered face calm but unyielding, like a man who'd seen every trick in the book. Jimmy leaned forward, flashing that grin that said he was about to stir trouble. The interview started innocently enough, with talk of Clint's new movie, its sweeping landscapes, and the kind of storytelling that made him a household name. But Jimmy couldn't resist. He leaned back, crossed his arms, and let the first jab fly. "So, Clint, this film, it's a bit, well, old school, right? I mean, do people still care about cowboys and dusty trails? Isn't that a little dated?" The audience tittered, sensing the edge in his tone. Clint's eyes narrowed, but he kept his voice low, steady. "You make films for people who feel the story, not for critics who think they know better." The crowd murmured, some clapping, but Jimmy wasn't fazed. He doubled down, his voice dripping with condescension. "Oh, come on, Clint. You're a legend, sure, but maybe it's time to pass the torch. Hollywood's moved on. You're, what, pushing 90? Maybe stick to golf." The audience gasped. A few laughed nervously, but the air turned thick. Clint's jaw tightened, his fingers gripping the armrest like he was holding back a punch. Jimmy, sensing he'd struck a nerve, kept pushing. "I mean, your last couple of movies, they didn't exactly light up the box office, did they? People want fresh, not recycled." He smirked, thinking he'd landed a knockout. Clint leaned forward, his voice a low growl. "You think you can sit there, kid, and tell me what I've earned? I was making films when you were begging for a gig in radio. You don't get to lecture me." The crowd erupted, some cheering. For Clint, others stunned by the venom in his words. Jimmy's smile faltered, but he wasn't done. He leaned in, voice sharp. "Hey, I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. You're a relic, Clint. Time to face it." The tension was a live wire now, sparking between them. Clint's eyes burned with a fire that hadn't dimmed in 50 years. "You want to talk? Relics. Look at your show. Same tired jokes, same smug face, night after night. You're not pushing boundaries, you're just loud." The audience roared, some booing Jimmy, others shouting for Clint. Jimmy's face reddened, his cool cracking. "You think you're untouchable because you're Clint Eastwood? This is my stage, old man." Clint stood, towering despite his age, his voice cutting through the noise. "Your stage? You're a sideshow act, Kimmel. You don't respect the craft, you mock it." The crowd was on its feet, the energy chaotic. Producers in the wings exchanged panicked glances, unsure whether to cut to commercial. Jimmy, now visibly rattled, tried to pivot. "All right, let's cool it down, talk about the movie." But Clint wasn't having it. "You wanted a fight, you got one. You don't get to jab at me and then hide behind your desk." He stepped closer, his presence commanding, every bit the man who'd stared down villains on screen and off. Jimmy stood too, trying to match him, but his voice wavered. "You want to go there? Fine. Maybe you're just too old to take a joke." That was the match to the gasoline. Clint's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Keep talking, Jimmy. See where it gets you." The audience held its breath, sensing something bigger was about to break. The confrontation was no longer about a movie or a quip. It was personal, raw, a clash of egos and eras, and it was only getting started. Clint Eastwood stood inches from Jimmy Kimmel, his shadow looming over the polished desk that separated them. The audience was a sea of gasps and shouts, some egging Clint on, others stunned by the raw hostility. Jimmy, his face flushed with a mix of anger and unease, tried to regain control, his hands gesturing wildly. "You're making a scene, Clint. Sit down, let's talk like adults." But his voice cracked, betraying the bravado he was clinging to. Clint didn't budge, his stare unyielding like a gunslinger waiting for the other man to flinch. "You don't get to call the shots here, sissy," Clint said, his words slow and deliberate, each one landing like a hammer. "You think you can drag my name through the mud for a laugh? You're not half the man you think you are." The crowd roared, feeding off the intensity. A woman in the front row yelled, "Get him, Clint!" while others hissed at Jimmy, who was visibly shrinking under the weight of the moment. He scrambled for a comeback, his eyes darting to the producers, who were now whispering frantically, into headsets. Jimmy forced a laugh, but it was hollow, desperate. "Oh, please, Clint. You're acting like I shot your horse. It's a talk show, not a saloon brawl." He leaned forward, trying to reclaim his turf. "You want to talk tough? Maybe you should have made a better movie. People are tired of your same old shtick." The jab was meant to sting, but it only fueled Clint's fire. He stepped closer, his voice a low rumble that silenced the room. "You wouldn't know a good story if it bit you. You peddle cheap gags while real artists bleed. For their work." The audience erupted again, clapping and shouting, some standing to get a better view of the showdown. Jimmy's composure was unraveling, his smirk replaced by a scowl. He slammed a hand on the desk, the sound sharp against the chaos. "You think you're some kind of hero? You're a has-been who can't take criticism. Get over yourself." The insult echoed, and for a moment the room felt like it might explode. Clint's eyes flashed, his fists clenching at his sides, but he held his ground, his silence more menacing than any shout. A producer edged closer to the stage, waving at Jimmy to cut to commercial, but Jimmy ignored him, too caught up in his own defiance. "You want to keep going, old man? I can do this all night. My show, my rules." Clint's lips curled into a grim smile, the kind that promised trouble. "Your show? You're a puppet for ratings, Kimmel. You don't own this stage. You rent it." The crowd went wild, some chanting Clint's name, others booing Jimmy, who looked like he'd been slapped. He stood taller, trying to match Clint's intensity, but his voice shook. "You're out of line, Eastwood. You don't get to come here and disrespect me." "Disrespect?" Clint shot back, his voice rising for the first time, cutting through, the noise like a blade. "You started this, kid. You took a swing at my life's work. You think I'll just sit here and take it?" He pointed a finger, steady and accusing, at Jimmy's chest. "You're the one out of line, hiding behind your jokes like a coward." The audience was on its feet now, the energy electric, teetering on the edge of chaos. A security guard appeared at the stage's edge, hesitant, unsure whether to step in. Jimmy, cornered, lashed out. "You're done, Clint. Security, get him out of here." He gestured wildly, his face a mask of fury and panic. The guard froze, caught between orders and the sight of Clint Eastwood. Unmovable, his presence a force of nature. Clint didn't flinch, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You want me gone? You'll have to drag me out yourself." The challenge hung in the air, daring Jimmy to cross a line he wasn't ready for. The crowd held its breath, waiting for the next move in a fight that was no longer just words. The studio was a powder keg, the air thick with shouts and the weight of a standoff that had spiraled beyond control. Clint Eastwood stood firm, his challenge to Jimmy Kimmel, "Drag me out yourself," ringing like a gunshot. Jimmy's face twisted, with rage, his confidence crumbling under the glare of a man who'd built a legacy on never backing down. The audience was a roaring tide, some chanting for Clint, others hurling insults at Jimmy, who stood behind his desk, trembling with fury, but caught in his own trap. "You think you can intimidate me?" Jimmy snapped, his voice shrill, betraying the fear creeping into his eyes. He jabbed a finger toward Clint, his words spilling out in a desperate bid to reclaim authority. "This is my turf, Eastwood. You don't get to storm in here and act like you own it." But his bravado was hollow, and the crowd sensed it, their cheers for Clint growing louder, drowning out Jimmy's protests. A second security guard joined the first, both hesitating at the stage's edge, unsure how to handle a legend who looked ready to take on the world. Clint stepped closer, his boots heavy on the polished floor, his voice a low, searing growl. "You built nothing, Kimmel. You tear down people who've earned their place, people who've poured their lives into their craft. You're a vulture, picking at scraps for laughs." The words hit like a fist, and the audience erupted, clapping and shouting, some leaping from their seats. Jimmy's eyes darted to the crowd, then back to Clint, his control slipping further with every second. "You're out of your depth, old man," he spat. But his voice wavered, and he took a half-step back. The tension snapped taut as Jimmy made a reckless move. He grabbed a water glass from his desk and hurled it to the floor, the shatter cutting through the noise like a thunderclap. "Get him out!" he screamed, pointing at Clint, his face red and veins bulging. The guards moved forward, but Clint raised a hand, not to fight, but to silence them, his presence alone enough to freeze them in place. "Touch me," he said, his voice deadly calm, "and you'll regret it." The guards stopped, glancing at each other, then at Jimmy, who was unraveling before their eyes. "You can't do this," Jimmy shouted, slamming both fists on the desk, papers scattering. "You're nobody here! This is my show!" But the crowd wasn't his anymore. They were on Clint's side, their cheers a wall of sound that battered Jimmy's ego. A woman yelled, "You messed with the wrong guy, Kimmel!" And others joined in, their voices a chorus of defiance. Clint's gaze never left Jimmy, his eyes burning with a quiet fury. "You wanted a spectacle," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "Now you've got one, but you don't get to rewrite who I am." Jimmy, desperate to save face, lunged for a comeback. "You're a washed-up cowboy who can't handle the truth," he yelled, but the words sounded weak, like a child's tantrum. Clint shook his head, almost pitying. "The truth? You wouldn't know it if it stared you in the face. You're not a host, Jimmy. You're a bully with a microphone." The audience roared louder, some stomping their feet, the energy surging like a wildfire. Producers scrambled in the wings, shouting into headsets, but it was too late. The show was no longer theirs. Clint turned to the crowd, his voice rising, steady but commanding. "This man thinks he can judge a lifetime of work with a smirk. He thinks he can tear down what took decades to build. You tell me, who's the fool here?" The audience answered with a deafening cheer, hands clapping, voices shouting his name. Jimmy's face went pale, his hands shaking as he realized he'd lost the room, the show, everything. The guard stepped back, unwilling to cross Clint, who stood like a monument, unbroken and unbowed. The confrontation was at its peak, and Jimmy was cornered, his empire of snark crumbling under the weight of a legend's resolve. The studio was a cauldron of noise, the audience's cheers for Clint Eastwood thundering like a stampede, their loyalty firmly with the man who'd faced down Jimmy Kimmel's venom and refused to yield. Jimmy stood behind his desk, his face ashen, his hands gripping the edge as if it could anchor him against the tide of defeat. Clint, unyielding, stared him down, his presence a towering rebuke to the host's crumbling bravado. The security guards had retreated, unwilling to challenge a legend whose every word carried the weight of a lifetime's battles. Jimmy's voice, now a strained rasp, tried one last jab. "You think you've won? You're just a loudmouth who can't take a hit." But the words fell flat, swallowed by the crowd's relentless roar. A man in the back shouted, "You're done, Kimmel!" And the chant spread, a wave of voices piling onto Jimmy's fading authority. Clint stepped forward, his boots deliberate, each step a nail in the coffin of Jimmy's ego. "You're not the judge of me," he said, his voice steady, cutting through the chaos. You're just a man who forgot what respect means." The audience surged to their feet, clapping, stomping, their energy a living force that shook the room. Jimmy's eyes flicked to the producers, who were frozen, their headsets silent, knowing the show was beyond saving. He tried to speak, his mouth opening, but no words came. Clint didn't need to raise his voice. His calm was more powerful than any shout. "I came here to talk about my work," he said, addressing the crowd now, his back to Jimmy. "This man wanted a fight. He thought he could tear me down for a laugh. But you don't break a man who's built something real." The crowd's response was deafening, a wall of sound that drowned out any chance of Jimmy reclaiming the moment. A woman yelled, "We love you, Clint!" and others joined, their voices a chorus of admiration. Clint raised a hand, not to quiet them but to acknowledge their support, his weathered face softening for a moment. "I make films for people like you," he said, his words simple but heavy with meaning. "Not for men like him who think a cheap shot makes them king." Jimmy, desperate, tried to interrupt. "This is my show," he shouted, but his voice was a squeak against the crowd's fury. He slammed his desk again, papers flying, but it was a futile gesture, like a child throwing a tantrum. Clint turned back to him, his eyes cold but triumphant. "Your show's over, Kimmel. You swung at the wrong man." He stepped toward the desk, and Jimmy flinched, stumbling back, his chair tipping slightly. The audience laughed, not with Jimmy's cruel humor but at his weakness, exposed for all to see. The producers finally moved, one rushing to the stage, whispering urgently to Jimmy, who waved him off, his face a mask of humiliated rage. Clint didn't wait for their orders. He turned to the crowd, gave a nod, and walked off the stage, his stride steady, unbroken. A man who'd faced worse than a smug host and come out stronger. The audience stood, clapping, chanting his name, their voices following him into the wings. Jimmy was left alone, the spotlight harsh on his sweat-streaked face, his show in ruins. As Clint disappeared, the crowd kept cheering, a tidal wave of support that carried beyond the studio walls. Jimmy sank into his chair, silent, knowing he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. The cameras cut to black, but the story was already spreading. Clint Eastwood, the legend, had faced down a bully and walked away taller. The audience, at home and in the room, would remember this not as Jimmy's moment, but as Clint's, a man who'd fought for his craft and won, leaving a defeated host to face the wreckage of his own making.